Okay, we are live.
Hello and welcome to our panel discussion on climate change, climate justice, organized by the Vermont Progressive Party. I'm Anthony Pollina. I serve in the Vermont State Senate representing Washington County. I'm also currently chair of the Vermont Progressive Party. The party, as you may know, is committed to social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice, but also it's important to realize the connections between these challenges that we face. This panel is one of a series bringing together elected policymakers, candidates, and citizen leaders to discuss these important issues and the way to move forward to positive change, even during the most challenging of times. You'll be able to find more information about the Progressive Party at progressiveparty.org or by visiting the websites of the organizations that are represented here tonight, or the elected officials or candidates that are joining us today as well. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time outlining the challenges of climate change. I would just mention that we just came off of the hottest September in 140 years. There's so many storms, weather storms, hurricanes and tropical storms this year that meteorologists had to start using the Greek alphabet to name them. And we all understand that this is going to have incredible impacts on our economy, our environment, and our quality of life and our very survival. Today, we're joined by six, excuse me, not counting myself, we're joined by 6 panelists who have a lot of experience and perspective on these issues. And we're taking the time to have them, give them the opportunity to join you in the conversation about where we're going on climate change and climate justice. So what I'm going to do is go right to the panelists, ask you to introduce yourselves, your organization, your position, describe briefly what brings you here tonight, and whether you think we're actually making progress going forward or backward when it comes to climate change here in the state of Vermont. We'll start with State Representative Mollie Burke.
Good evening. I hope that my internet connection will be stable and I won't freeze. I represent Brattleboro in the legislature. I'm a member of the House, and when I first ran for the legislature in 2008, I had been concerned about climate change for a very long time, and that is the issue that really inspired me to run. And when I came to the House, I requested to be on the Transportation Committee because I knew that transportation was a big emitter of greenhouse gases. And so I have been able to sit on the Transportation Committee for 12 years. In addition to cutting emissions, which has been really interesting, I also really interested in diversifying our transportation system, making it not just about vehicles, but bicycling, pedestrian access, rail, public transit, accessibility for persons with disabilities. But it's the emissions issue, and I think the climate justice that we're here to talk about. I was surprised when I came to the legislature that there was not much talk about climate change at all. And it's taken a while, and I felt like I was able to do a little bit of nibbling around the edges with some bicycle safety legislation, and I worked on the complete streets legislation, and also an anti-idling bill. But all of that is just so minor compared to what we need to do. I think I presented some legislation around electric vehicle incentives that went nowhere. Eventually, the governor came with a proposal for some money to go into electric vehicle incentives. We were able to do that in 2019, 2020, and just put some money into public transit. So I think that things are moving faster than they were, not fast enough. And I don't know if you want me to talk about this now, but what the Transportation Committee is proposing some very bold, or some members of the Transportation Committee are proposing some very bold steps for our upcoming session. So I'll stop there. And
great, thank you, appreciate it. Appreciate it. Lauren Hierl with Vermont Conservation Voters.
Hey, good evening. Thanks so much for having me tonight and joining us. Lauren Hierl, I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And for those not familiar with VCV, we are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization We work to help elect pro-environment candidates, and excited to be joined by some great candidates here tonight. We also work to advocate for strong environmental laws and then hold lawmakers accountable using tools like our environmental scorecard, so that we can then educate voters on what people are doing when they show up in elected office. I've been running VCV since 2014 and have been an environmental and climate advocate for the past 15 years or so. I've done that in Vermont and in Washington, DC, and did a few years as a scientist studying climate change in South Africa and in Southern California. But I've been in Vermont for the past decade, and I'm so grateful to call it home, especially during these really challenging times, and have two young children that keep me grounded in the urgency of climate action every single day. And really honored to join the conversation with you all tonight. You know, having done this work for a long time, I couldn't agree more with what Mollie said about, you know, we've been nibbling around the edges for so long, and there's so much opportunity to do more. And we've been getting passed by neighboring states, by states across the country in recent years. We have great rhetoric about what a leader we are, and, you know, a great history of some really innovative climate policies, but we're now getting leapfrogged, and it's time to get back to the forefront. So I'm really excited to explore some of those topics tonight and continue working with you all. Thanks.
Appreciate it. I think we'll take some time later to talk about why it seems that we don't seem to be able to reach our goals. We seem to be good at setting goals, but not so good at actually meeting those goals when the time comes to do that. Next, we're going to hear from Heather Surprenant, who's a candidate for the Vermont legislature.
Yeah, thank you all. My name is Heather Surprenant, and as Anthony just said, I am a candidate for the Vermont House of Representatives and co-owner of Moonlighting Farm in Barnard, Vermont. So climate change for me is important both personally and professionally. As a young Vermonter, I have a vested interest in creating a more just and sustainable future for generations to come, including my own. And it's so important that we look at long-term environmental impacts of our behavior and be diligent in creating legislation that looks beyond quick fixes. We need a legislature that works to truly heal our landscape, which, as a farmer, having access to arable land is critical. I rely on consistent weather patterns for the planning of my season, so you can imagine the challenges farmers face when a frost comes 3 weeks earlier, or those cool, rainy spring days we need for our early greens production turn into 90-degree days in drought. This was one of the driest seasons I have ever experienced in my farming career, and it illuminated even more the need for our state to lead the conversation on climate justice. Farmers cannot be left out of the conversation on climate discourse because our practices play a critical role in mitigating precisely what we are trying to reverse, which is the negative impact that poor ecological management has created. I am so grateful to be part of this panel of folks who share my passion and concern for Vermont's green future, and I'm excited to hear what everyone has to say tonight. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We're very grateful that you're running for office. What towns would you be representing should you be in the legislature?
Sure, Barnard, Pomfret, West Hartford, and Quechee.
Great. Next, we're going to hear from Representative Selene Colburn.
Oh, great. So hi, I'm Selene Colburn. I am a representative for Burlington's Chittenden 6-4 district with Brian Chena is my district mate. And that's the part of Burlington that where UVM is located and many of the student dense neighborhoods to the north. Prior to, I'm just finishing my second term in the legislature and running for my third. And prior to that, I served 2 terms as a city councilor in Burlington. And I really started working on climate policy in that role at the city level, and got involved in the divestment movement. So did some work to try to advance some planning and conversation about divestment of the city's pension funds, and was working closely with UVM students in particular who were advocating for UVM to divest, which it finally pledged to do this past year. But as you can imagine, this is an issue that is greatly important to my constituents. I think I have possibly the youngest constituency in the state, and I hear not just from college students, but I have constituents who are middle schoolers who are like passionate advocates on this issue that I've been meeting and working with, and just so inspired by their leadership. Another thing that I have worked on a little bit at the municipal level, not so much at the state level, is pollinator protection. So worked on getting neonicotinoid pesticides banned in city parks and public lands. And when I came to the legislature, having worked especially on the divestment issue and been a little bit involved in some of the conversations that were happening in state, I gravitated quickly to the Climate Solutions Caucus, and I serve as the clerk of that group. So that's just a group of senators, legislators, and we're often joined by friends from the advocacy community, and even just like passionate folks from around the state who really care about this issue, to really start to plan and put together a meaningful platform and work strategically together to make that happen. And we've been really upping our strategy and planning in recent years with some, I think some decent results, although we have so much work to do. And you'll hear Lauren talk about the Global Warming Solutions Act in a minute, which is a piece of legislation that I helped to introduce in a couple of its forms, and that I think lays out a really important framework for the state moving forward. But one of my biggest concerns, as someone who likes to think big, Robb kid, one of my biggest concerns is that the legislature might get complacent, particularly with the passage of that bill, and sort of be like, well, let's let the planning group do its work. Let's let this play out. And so my mission heading into the next biennium is to continue to push us in the Climate Caucus and in the legislature as a whole to think big on the issue of climate action, take big actions, not take a wait and see approach, and pat on ourselves on the back for, finally moving some meaningful action forward.
Great. I think it's also really important that you mentioned the young people, because their voices are really important to these debates. I mean, you were able to reach divestment in Burlington. We tried to do that in the state level, as you know, and well, we were not successful yet. But what was important about the debate there was a lot of young people came into the State House to talk about divestment and climate justice and the future of the planet. And their voices were really powerful and inspiring. So it was great to have them there. Next, we're going to hear from Robb Kidd, who's with the Vermont Sierra Club.
Yes, it's actually my pleasure to follow Representative Selene Think Big Colburn. So I'm glad you acknowledged that part, the Think Big. Anyway, I'm Robb Kidd with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club. We're a nonpartisan, the nation's largest environmental conservation group with over 4.2 million members across the country. In the Vermont, we have about 14,000 members and supporters. So what I try to do with my work is to amplify our members and supporters' voices. If you see the picture behind me, that's from the People's Climate Rally here in Montpelier back in 2016, where we had about 5,000 people on the State House lawn demanding climate action. I've been involved with some other major protests, even the New York City People's Climate March, where we had 17 buses from Vermont going to the big New York City People's Climate Rally. And what the Sierra Club has made it as a #1 priority nationally is climate change, but also equity and inclusion, and making sure we're hearing voices from those who've been most marginalized from the climate impacts. So we actually have to make sure we're working on that, improving that. In Vermont, I'm actually here because climate change impacts the emissions from climate from transportation is about 52% of our current amount of emissions that come from transportation. We made that as our #1 priority issue to work on. So I follow a lot of the great work that Representative Mollie Burke is doing in the State House. And I've seen the dramatic shift in the way the consciousness is within the thought process around transportation, even in the Senate as well. People are starting to talk about climate. So we'll talk a little bit more in a moment.
We'll talk more about transportation as well. I like the way you say, even in the Senate, they're starting to talk about these things as if the Senate's lagging behind the rest of the legislature, correct?
Well, Well, no, I was talking about the Senate Transportation Committee, which everybody could be surprised with Chairman Mazza, who's even supported the Global Warming Solutions Act and has been responding to climate issues.
Correct. Next, we're going to hear from Chloe Collins, who's another candidate, another inspiring candidate from up in Franklin County. Talk to us, Chloe.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I came to Vermont actually to attend Vermont Law School because they're the top environmental law program in the country, and I really wanted to do environmental law. So I got my law degree and my master's there in environmental law and policy. And then I graduated and I could not find a single job in America protecting the environment as a lawyer. I applied to something like 1,000 jobs across the continental US and could not find work. I did work briefly for the state of Vermont as an environmental analyst, and I helped develop and work on the universal recycling law for about a year. And then I kind of shifted my focus to restorative justice work. So I spent the last 5 years as a case manager running restorative panels at a justice center. So I feel like between the two, the environmental degree and then the work in justice, and recently I've been really focused on racial equity. I created a race and equity panel or committee in my town of Swanton. I've become kind of known in my community because I was Swanton used to have these communal art boards, and anyone could paint on them at any time. And usually art would stay 6 months or a year. And I started doing what I call unity paintings. So BLM paintings and black and white hand holding paintings. And I became the target of a group of supremacists and Patriot Front folks who whited out my artwork every time I finished painting it. So this went on kind of a battle of the boards for months until Swanton actually voted to take down the boards. And I was so upset by the town's reaction. Actually, some of the supremacists got apologies, and I have never gotten an apology. So I thought, if I can't really create change and voice through my artwork, I have to do more. So I decided to run kind of last minute in June. Kate LaRose reached out to me and asked me if I'd want to run. And I said, yeah, you know what? I feel like I have to do more. I was trying to use my art to make BIPOC feel safe and welcome in this community. But if I don't have art as my forum, or if that forum is being kind of trampled, then I got to do more. So I'm running to be a voice for marginalized folks in our communities. I've seen firsthand the racism that exists here and in Franklin County, and I'm running to really, I want everyone to feel welcome and safe in Vermont. That's my goal. So between my background in environmental law and my passion for the environment, and then my kind of newfound passion for racial equity, kind of feel like there's a lot to talk about in current global landscape. So I'm excited to get into a dialogue, but that's just a little bit about me and why this topic appealed to me and why I'm running. So thanks for having me.
Well, that's a lot. And you're right, there's a lot of work to be done. I appreciate what you've been doing so far. So we're going to touch on a couple of issues in more detail. We'll talk about the Global Warming Solutions Act and Green New Deal, but also more about agriculture and the role of agriculture in climate change, or the impact of climate change on agriculture might be the better way to put it. But also transportation, which, as two of our guests mentioned, is a big issue. So we're going to start going back to Mollie Burke first. Mollie, talk to us a little bit about what you've been doing around transportation in the legislature, and maybe a little bit about just kind of impacts that transportation actually has on the climate. And we know in Vermont, we're sort of addicted to our cars. We don't have a lot of public transportation, and it's just the way it is. And it's a big step for us to move away from individual vehicles in order to reduce our emissions. So talk a little bit about what you see happening and possibility for what may happen.
Well, you're so right that it's a challenge. And during the time that I've been in the legislature, 12 years, it's very disheartening to see that during that time our emissions actually went up, despite having, as we talked about, having plans, comprehensive energy plan, lots of ideas and goals, et cetera, how many electric vehicles we're going to get to by 2025, et cetera. So I feel like we're right now, I think, with the passions of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the leadership in our committee, Representative Kurt McCormick has been a really great leader in this realm. And there are, I think, several of us on the Transportation Committee who are very, very activist minded, and we really want to see some really significant changes in how we do transportation, how we and particularly thinking about incentives for electrification, better public transit. We just put $500,000 extra into public transit, following a study that we had commissioned about how to increase transit ridership and expand transit in rural areas. And there were some really exciting things happening, I think, in transportation. I was just participated in the Energy Action Network Summit, which was really about energy emissions and equity. And it was a really inspiring summit. And part of the summit is people give pitches about what their projects might be. And so there was a pitch to use, first of all, electrified transportation, electrify the bus system, and have the buses be, instead of school buses, the buses would just be public buses taking, people to work, kids to school, delivering elders to, lunch places and things like that. And so it was just, and then Sue Minter from Capstone Community Action, she and Linda McGinnis had a plan about incentives for people giving up their gas guzzling vehicles and getting into better fuel efficient cars, not necessarily an electric vehicle, but a vehicle where they are going to be saving money. So it's really about how can you help low income people save money while also protecting the environment. So I feel like we're sort of poised in an exciting moment. Of course, we need, as everybody knows, we need to have things that come out of committee that are voted on by the majority of the committee. We need to have the legislature, the House and the Senate support these measures. But I do think that people are waking up to the climate crisis and the need to really invest in solutions. We can talk, maybe Rob wants to talk about the Transportation Climate Initiative at some point, but that's another possibility for hopefully raising some revenue to do the things that we need to do. But our proposals for this year center around much more electrification, incentives for electric vehicles, charging stations, electrifying public transit. And there's an exciting project going on that's going to start in January in Montpelier, a pilot project that's going to be demand response transportation. So instead of having 3 fixed routes traveling around like a 5 square mile area, it would be, you would use your phone or your dial-up phone and call the bus and say, I want to go to the hospital at this time. And the bus would come. And so you'd have, instead of those 3 buses traveling around in these fixed routes, they would be going to your house to take you somewhere else and going to pick up somebody else. And that's sort of a new concept in transportation, but it solves some of the issues of people not wanting to be on crowded buses and also getting people to the last mile. A lot of people can't take public transit because they can't walk the mile, or the 1 block or 2 blocks or half a mile to the bus stop. And so I think that there's some, a lot of electrification ideas out there, a lot of public transit ideas. And I think the realization that we have to act now. And if Vermont acts, we can, in concert with everybody else, other states, we just need to get on the bandwagon, and we're not necessarily leading, and make some significant progress.
One thing you mentioned about microtransit, the Montpelier experiment, they call it microtransit, and I think that's a really good possibility as well. There's a lot of people who live on the outskirts of a city like Montpelier who then drive into work, and they're only driving about a mile or so, but they're still driving into town, driving through the stoplights, getting into the traffic jams, parking their car somewhere.
Yeah.
The microtransit would make it possible for those people to simply get on a minivan or a little bus and just be brought into town. They're already in the community. They shouldn't be driving around the community if they don't.
Right.
they
And
don't
most people drive like a couple miles.
Right.
Yeah. And
Just quickly, I'm wondering, you didn't mention anything about rail. Is there anything going on around
of course,
possibility of
I
rail?
love rail, and I take the train whenever I can. I have family in Buffalo. We are, the state spends about $8 million subsidizing, paying for Amtrak to come to the state. The big goal has been to get the train to go to Montreal. It used to go to Montreal. but they don't, there's, sort of problems with the track just over the Canadian border. And also they do not, in this post 9/11 age, they don't want to do immigration on the tracks, although they do it in other places. So I don't know what the problem is. So there've been these sort of agreements sort of between Quebec and Canada and the US around being able to build an immigration facility, a secure immigration facility like you would find in an airport, where you come in and you can't go out anywhere until you go through customs, and to be able to allow US immigration officers on Canadian soil. So it's just happening really slowly. Once that happens, the train can go to Montreal, which will increase ridership because, Montreal is a destination. St. Albans is not.
Sure.
So, people gradually sort of drop off the train. They might get on in Brattleboro off of Montpelier or even Essex. So that would be just great. And that's been the priority. Also, the track is almost ready to have the train go, that goes, the Ethan Allen Express that goes from Albany to Rutland right now to get all the way to Burlington. And
I look forward.
that could
I look
happen
for-
every year.
That's great. I look forward to the day when we can take a train from Montpelier to Burlington, for instance, as an example. That'd be great.
Well, that's another problem because the tracks between Burlington and Essex don't line up. But
Right.
somebody said to me once that we had the best transportation system in the world. We have the best transportation system in the 30s. Because there were 6 trains a day that went from Brattleboro to New York.
Right.
It's just insane that we have one train that goes up the eastern side of the state and one that goes up the western, and then there's also but there is a line that's coming. 2 other trains come up to Greenfield, Mass from New Haven, and that's pretty exciting. And a lot of people in my area have been driving to Greenfield to get on that extra train because the times work out better. So.
Right. Lauren Hierl from the Vermont Conservation Voters, you've spent a lot of time working on the Global Warming Solutions Act the last couple of decades, it seems, probably the last year mostly, but it's became a very controversial bill in many ways, and it was vetoed by the governor and a veto override by the legislature. Tell us a little bit about, more specifically, what exactly this bill would do and what kind of impact it could have on Vermont's efforts around climate change.
Yeah, thanks. So, we were really thrilled that this bill did get enacted, and it might have felt controversial, but there were overwhelming votes in support in the House and Senate, of course, to override a veto. And this was really a top priority coming into this year, and we have been working on it for a few years. But the Climate Solutions Caucus, which I believe somebody else will be talking about briefly, but Legislative Caucus really prioritized and did a ton of work on this bill leading into the session, meeting with more than 1,000 Vermonters across the state. I'm part of a 30-member coalition along with Robb and faith groups, low-income groups, affordable housing, youth groups, businesses, public health, whole bunch of people who care passionately about these issues and really came together and prioritized Global Warming Solutions Act. And fundamentally, the bill creates an accountability framework. So it says, instead of having climate goals, we have requirements to ratchet down our climate pollution over time. So it sets up targets starting as soon as 2025 and works its way down to net zero by 2050. And it sets up a planning and implementation framework to ensure that we're really doing that work in a way that centers equity, that incorporates our farms and forests, and that really looks at rural and marginalized communities and how we can, be doing what we know are all these win-win opportunities of more affordable energy solutions for people that also drive down our climate pollution. And this accountability framework is really achieved by having a set of deadlines for action and a need to create a climate action plan that then we're implementing, we're hitting pollution targets, and it allows Vermonters, so any of us could hold the state accountable through the court system to take additional action if we're not doing enough to hit our targets. And we've seen in a number of other states with similar frameworks that just having that accountability really changes the conversation and changes what becomes possible to do through the legislature and so on. It sets up a climate council that is the group that comes up with that plan, and it has 4 subcommittees that I think really speak to the core of kind of the vision of the leaders of this bill, which were resilience and adaptation, mitigation, so that's just driving down the pollution, equity and justice, and again, the role our farms and forests will play in capturing and storing carbon. So, you know, we think that this framework is going to be really even more important than ever. You know, coming into the session, we thought this was going to be important, but with COVID and having to figure out how we're rebuilding and recovering, you know, really doing this thoughtful, forward-looking, strategic planning, focusing equity and justice and impacts on marginalized communities, I think is going to be even more essential to getting this work done and done right and well. And, you know, again, this puts us in line with what a lot of other states are doing. So I think we'll have a lot of opportunity to learn from and, you know, look at what's working well in other states and, you know, as we innovate ourselves. So kind of the next steps from here, they're going to be standing up this climate council and, you know, ensuring that there's some great people on that. So the Speaker of the House and the Senate Committee on Committees are making appointments sometime in the coming weeks. So I know they've been collecting a lot of names of some great people, but we're really, you know, hoping that they appoint a group of people that can tap into the expertise and people that really want to get this done well and thoughtfully and strategically. And we're also going to be working to ensure there's a lot of opportunity for public engagement. You know, this should be something that lots of Vermonters are involved in. And, you know, there's so many ideas, there's so many things we already know that we could do, but making sure that Vermonters are weighing in on what we prioritize. And, you know, again, that how we do it matters so much. So really hope that people will keep following and staying engaged with that process. And it is going to be something that is continuing to interplay with the legislature because, you know, the legislature are going to be overseeing the process. And at the end of the day, anything that takes, you know, a real meaningful policy change is going to come back to the legislature. So we know we're going to have to keep passing policies, you know, and as Selena said, you know, this is actually just motivation to do more. This is not this was not the end point. And any budget decisions are going to be the legislature. And we know that so much of this has gotten stalled out because it takes investment. And so I know we're going to talk about the Green New Deal and other ideas in a minute of how we really dramatically increase our investment in these solutions. But, you know, to me, I think a big part of why this whole framework became so important was really shifting the conversation in the state from whether we should take certain climate actions to which actions should we take now, which ones should we do first, and also matching the scale and scope of the crisis with the solutions we're offering. You know, again, we've been doing kind of little steps that were positive, but, you know, you're only going this far and we need to be going this far. And so, you know, finally being able to be held accountable, I think is going to be a game changer and what is going to become, you know, politically possible and, you know, required for us to do. So that kind of is the core of it, and really excited to work with all of you on, you know, taking it to the next steps of implementation.
You talk about accountability, which is obviously really important. There was a lot of people, opponents, who were concerned that projects would be undertaken without the legislature having any oversight, which I think is not true. I mean, these decisions have to come back to the legislature to be funded, for example. But it was also pretty interesting to me that throughout this debate, some of the opponents were really riled up by the fact that citizens were going to be involved in this process. They didn't really want citizens involved in making these decisions. I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. Isn't that one of the important goals we have, is to keep citizens as involved as possible in making these decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like there was a lot of misunderstanding, willful or not, about what the bill would do. You know, I think citizens will be engaged both in developing the plan and just having this accountability tool. I mean, really all of our environmental laws have a citizen accountability. That's how they've always worked and functioned, and that's what's made them succeed, is knowing that, you know, you need to follow the law and that citizens can hold you accountable if you can't. So it's not a new or unusual approach to addressing issues. It's quite common. And, you know, to me, I absolutely believe that it's going to take, as many people as possible thinking creatively, strategically about, how we do this work, because it impacts all of us. And so, let's get as many good minds together, thinking about this and figuring this out and being creative. And so, that's a piece that I'm most excited about. So it was a little bizarre to see people concerned about that approach.
Right. They don't want citizens mucking up the process because legislators are doing such a good job that they don't need citizen input. This is it's a prime case of if the citizens lead, the leaders will eventually follow the citizens going in the right direction. So I appreciate that. I want to talk with Heather a bit, Heather Surprenant, a bit about her role as a farmer and her experiences with climate change as a farmer, and maybe some ideas or some thoughts about steps we can take to promote a more sustainable form of farming that would be more compatible with protecting our environment.
Yeah, sure. So climate change is woven into the fabric of my livelihood. Inconsistencies in weather make an already challenging profession that much harder. And as I had mentioned earlier, this season was particularly dry. And for those of us who are small-scale farmers, we don't all have the infrastructure or the resources in place to combat unpredictable conditions. On my farm, we have a very basic irrigation setup, and we didn't even come close to watering our crops the way we needed to. And that's hard when you have markets relying on your product. I think sometimes folks forget that connection to where their food comes from and just how much work and planning goes into a successful season. From the farming perspective, what I think COVID has shed light on is our need for food security and food sovereignty. I saw personally such an uptick in consumers wanting to buy locally sourced produce, and this is beneficial on a few fronts. First, the more we can support our local farmers, the less reliant we are on goods trucked in from out of state, thus essentially lowering our carbon footprint. And then supporting local grows our economy and creates healthy communities. And additionally, consumers who are concerned with how their food is produced elevates the conversation around sustainability and encourages farms to adopt regenerative practices. We as farmers have this responsibility to make sure the way we are farming isn't taxing the land and then further exacerbating climate change. I think people are quick to point out all the ways in which agriculture is negatively contributing to climate change. And they're definitely not wrong, but it's also essential that we address all the ways in which farming responsibly can repair the damage done as well. And there are many steps that farmers and legislators can take to actively change the course we're on. And in order to promote a just transition to sustainable agriculture, we need to change the way we talk about the dairy industry in our state and agriculture in general. Our focus shouldn't really be on farms getting bigger, but rather maintaining a scale that decreases our dependency on pesticides and herbicides. And farmers truthfully shouldn't be shamed for trying to just make a living, and instead, we should work to understand the real needs of our dairy community and crop farmers and create policy incentives to help those within the agricultural industry to become part of the solution. The well-being of farmers should be a priority, and if we are to halt the harmful effects of climate change, that really needs to be the case. Small steps that we can take are increasing our biodiversity, restoring habitats. Much of Vermont's cropland is in corn, and if we could convert incrementally parcels of monocropped land with cover crops that work to attract beneficial insects, restore soil health, retain water and carbon, and prevent soil erosion, we could be steps closer to protecting our waterways and adding life back into the land. I think it's important that we work to educate our communities on the importance of proper land stewardship. And we need to make sure that if we are creating legislation, literally from the ground up, that farmers have the resources they need to succeed. In my opinion, and I think a lot of regenerative farmers feel this way, that healthy soil is truly the key to sustainable farming and the very first steps we should be taking as a state to address the climate crisis. So I hope that if elected to the legislature, that's something that I can really bring to the table and talk about what it truly means to be a sustainable farmer and what it means to be a regenerative farmer.
Part of what it means, I believe, is that we have to realize that nature works. If we just let it do its thing, it'll work just fine. We've developed an agriculture in this country and in this world, which basically is in conflict with nature at times, or we're trying to like make agriculture, make nature serve our needs, whether it's through biotechnology or the use of pesticides. We've turned our dinner into a cancer risk with pesticides, and we say, oh, pesticides are not so great, so let's do genetic engineering instead, and find out that's not so great either. And what we should realize is that nature works, and we just need to learn to work with it. I think that's really important. And also, you kind of implied this, but I think it's time to start paying farmers to do the right thing instead of just subsidizing agriculture so it get bigger. Giving farmers incentives to like develop clean water and healthier soils, things of that sort, which benefits all of us in the long run. So I appreciate what you have to say. Appreciate it. Selene and Colburn, you talked before, you said you remember you're part of the climate caucus in the legislature. Talk to us a little bit about that. And also Lauren mentioned that you might have something to say about the Green New Deal efforts as well. So what's up with that? You're muted.
It's getting later in my long day of Zoom call, of online meetings and calls. Yeah, I'll just say really briefly, as I alluded to before, the Climate Solutions Caucus, it's an issues-based caucus in the legislature of senators and House representatives in the House who care about advancing climate action and reducing our emissions and are trying to come up with collective strategies. It was founded by Mary Hooper and Chris Pearson a number of years ago. And really in the past years, it's grown and grown and grown. It's the largest issues-based caucus in the legislature, and it's actually nearly as big as the House Democratic Caucus in membership at this point. So there's just been this groundswell of interest. And in the last year in particular, we really hunkered down and did some planning. What I observed when I first arrived in the legislature is actually a lot of people were wanting to work on climate action and advancing climate solutions through policy, but we might all agree that weatherization was a key thing that we needed to do to advance that policy, but we might end up with like half a dozen to a dozen weatherization bills that propose different funding sources, different ways of enacting programs. And so we weren't finding that we could coalesce around a single vision for how to advance something as effectively as we wanted to. And so we really like did some very meaningful planning. We did a retreat and came up with a platform of bills, including the Global Warming Solutions Act and some others, and tried to move them forward. And even in our COVID year, I think we got 3 out of 5 of those core bills passed. And so that organizing effort has been key, I think, to starting to help this momentum find shape into meaningful action in the legislature. The Green New Deal, that's language that gets used all the time, and it really draws its inspiration from a resolution that was introduced at the federal level that lays out, so it's not a bill, right? It's a resolution that lays out a map for how we could get to net zero by 2050 and what kind of strategies, values, and principles would need to be behind that. And it's very forward thinking, that it's like really centers a just transition. So helping folks who might struggle the most with some of the things that are required for excuse me, that transition to get the supports they need, whether that's low income folks, whether it's people who have making sure that actually reparations are made to communities who have been disproportionately impacted already or stand to be disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change and who've just faced like injustice on all fronts. It really tries to connect the idea of making this transition to a strong labor movement and to strong principles around organized labor, around creating good jobs around the right to organize in the workplaces of those jobs. It centers Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights. And so it's a really bold vision, but it's not like a piece of policy that if we passed it, we'd have all those things. It's a resolution. And so in Vermont, a number of people, including you, Senator Pollina, have put forward also really visionary ideas about what a Green New Deal could look like. So I know, Anthony, you have a bill that would reclaim some of those Trump era tax breaks that went to the very wealthiest Vermonters to start funding projects, climate action and climate justice projects. The AFL-CIO, which is one of the largest labor unions in the state, has been starting to do some visioning about what this would look like for them and their membership, and are really eager to develop a plan. Vermonters for a New Economy, which is a group that is formed around a number of just like transformative visions for our economy, including the initiation of a state bank, another issue that Anthony has been an incredible leader on. They've started to map out what that Green New Deal could look like. The Youth Climate Lobby has started to map out what a Green New Deal could look like. So I think the real idea is like that we make really strategic, large scale investments, that this is connected to the labor movement, connected to equity, connected to rights and reparations for BIPOC individuals and communities, and that we commit to a bold vision. But I think I have sometimes encountered, like, as we move these incremental individual things forward, whether it's Global Warming Solutions Act or, you know, something that starts to get at some smaller adjustments to the state's renewable energy goals and where we're sourcing our renewable energy from. I sometimes encounter this resistance where people are like, this isn't enough. We need the Green New Deal. We need the whole thing. We need the whole vision. But if you talk to the people who, or listen to the people who are really working at the federal level to roll up their sleeves and figure out what the policy of a Green New Deal will look like. And I'm thinking about someone like Rhianna Gunn-Wright, who's working with a policy think tank called New Consensus, doing super interesting work, mapping out what it would really take to move us forward, like bill by bill, right, with a federal Green New Deal. She did a great podcast with Ezra Klein that I really recommend listening to about that. And she's really clear, and others are really clear, like this is going to take lots of bills incrementally over a period of many years, just as the sort of original federal New Deal did. That wasn't like one and done kind of bill, right? That was lots of pieces of policy building up to in support of a vision and shaping the vision as they fell into place. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to remember. I will just leave with the thought that it was so striking to me in that conversation that, you know, even as the conversation that I listened to, the podcast with Rhianna Gunn-Wright, that she was like, we really need to put the shovel in the ground here. Like, we cannot just let the sort of perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, absolutely, we need to think bold. Absolutely, we need to think comprehensively. Absolutely, we need to center equity, center jobs, you know, but like, we can't, you know, there was a whole conversation where people were like, are the target numbers correct? And she was like, we got to just put the shovel in the ground. Like, we can keep improving the target numbers, but we have to start doing work. And so I think of the Green New Deal, whether it's locally or federally, as like a series of things in support of a larger vision. And hopefully we're already doing it. So maybe we're on our way. Maybe some of the work we did this session is one step towards that bigger goal, that bigger vision.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger pieces that's missing right now is that lack of investment to get things done. I'm a little concerned that we set goals through the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is a good thing to do. We have citizens involved in coming up with priorities, but the state's going to then turn around and say, well, we don't have the money to do weatherization. We don't have the money to invest in electric vehicles, whatever that might be. And I think we have to find a way to make those investments possible by generating revenue that would actually allow us to make investments in those kinds of things. So I appreciate the fact that it's far reaching, and the old fashioned New Deal didn't happen overnight either. It was a variety of bills that took a long time to implement. So appreciate your perspective on that.
Well, and I would say we've been working very hard on advancing proposals about raising revenue. I know you have in the Senate, the House Progressive Caucus has, and that's like a laser focus issue for me in the coming biennium, both in support of climate action and just making sure we meet the needs of Vermonters during this really challenging time.
Appreciate it. Robb Kidd is going to, you've also talked a lot about climate change from different points of view, but one thing you've been focusing on, again, similar to Mollie, is transportation. But talk about your position in terms of what we might be able to do when it comes to transportation, and also other aspects of the Sierra Club's priorities would be good to hear.
Okay, so regarding with transportations, one of the biggest things about doing is if we rapidly incentivize electric vehicles. Right now, we have about 4,000 electric vehicles on the road, but the Comprehensive Energy Plan calls for 60,000 by 2025. And then also the Energy Action Network calls for 90,000 vehicles just to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. We're nowhere near getting that, and we need to get to those particular goals as quick as we can. But one of the categories you talked about this conversation was to be about environmental justice. And a lot of people have always looked at electric vehicles as being, oh, it's a rich man's toy. It's not going to help the poor. It's not going to help those who can't afford it. And it's only going to be helping those who are wealthy. Well, that's a false belief system. Basically, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a study last year stating that in rural communities, the best thing they could do would be to electrify their transportations, and because it would help the general economy, because it would keep money within the economy of the state. 65 cents of every dollar you spend on electricity stays within Vermont. Anything, when you spend about, I think it's about 85 cents of every dollar you spend on gasoline gets shipped right out, goes off to the Middle East, goes down to Texas, or even Canada too as well. But it leaves the state, it leaves the whole economy. So what we should do is invest in a vehicle electrification to keep that money here, creating good local jobs, part of the concept within the Green New Deal. Even still, with basic incentives, if we drop down the cost of an electric vehicle and target it for lower income folks, we can get more people on the road who are driving further distances to get to work. When and then even with the cost of mileage on a car, electric vehicles do not cost, their maintenance costs are a lot lower. The average cost for equivalent to a gallon, it would be $1.80 if you would be paying. Right now, with the gas prices dropped, that's only a temporary thing. That's based on current electric rates. Then you can even get some greater incentives from Green Mountain Power. Even for those, most people are probably enlisted are Green Mountain Power, or even the Velco, even all the other power utilities, all are offering, Burlington Electric are offering incentives. So we can create a more attractive economy by going to vehicle electrification, saving people money, and helping people reduce their carbon emissions. But we're gonna have to do a lot more work towards that. We can incentivize vehicles. Like as Representative Mollie Burke said, she introduced legislation to do that a couple of years ago. The governor introduced in his budget just like mere pennies compared to what we really need to do. And we need to do a lot more. We need to do a lot more around charging accessing charging. A lot of people who live in multi-dwelling homes cannot charge their vehicles. So we need to find ways to do that. Find ways for people that can charge while they're at their workplace or dropping their kids off at school, wherever they can access that to make it more accessible. So there's a lot of really good things that we can do just by even like you even talked about the money aspect. There's a lot of good things, thought process that I think members from Mollie's committee are thinking about doing is reappropriating current transportation budget money. I think there's over $600 million in the transportation budget that are going to the old ways of transportation. Let's rethink about it and think about other ways. And then one other point I want to bring out that also Representative Burke referenced was the Transportation Climate Initiative. For those who don't know, it's a market-based system, a cap and what we call cap and invest, where it would auction off the proceeds of gasoline, and Vermont would be receiving a pocket full of money on that. Now, yes, it would raise the cost of gasoline on everybody, but if we're smart with it, we can reinvest it in programs that are going to help people immediately. There's been talk on it about in the national level, well, on the regional level, because this is for the Northeast, about making a requirement where 30% of the proceeds go to helping low-income folks. That's something we have to think about when we're designing these programs, to making sure it's not going to unfairly affect those who are low income, those of the BIPOC community. We got to make sure that these programs are helping people transition, because we need to go there together, not just for a select few transition to a clean economy. We need to be all moving to a clean economy.
So some of the money from the transportation initiative theoretically could go towards helping incentivize the purchase of electric vehicles by middle income or lower income people as well, right?
Oh, yep. Yeah, so to clarify, all the proceeds that we would put into this could be spent back, and the legislature would dictate on how those proceeds could say. So you as a senator could say, I wanted to go towards that particular program. Heather Surprenant, if you make it in there as an agriculture, you can say, I think, incentivizing good farming practices could be a good practice we can go on. So, but that's something the legislator will have to decide.
Is there also a possibility, you talked about using electric vehicles for mass transit as well, buses, things of that sort? There are some electric buses going around these days, right?
Yep, there's a couple of them in the state. I can't remember now. I think there's 2 out now. Burlington uses one within the city routes, and but there's talk, and there's, I think, 4 school districts have, under a pilot program, have an electric bus. But that's, I think, the concept is, let's make all the buses electrified. Let's make all the school buses. So you even think about the climate aspects of the school buses spewing dirty diesel in front of a school where the school kids are breathing that. All the air, all the costs associated with that. Let's go clean. So you can do that with mass transit as well.
Appreciate that. Chloe Collins, talk to us a little bit about what you see going on in Franklin County, which is, as Heather mentioned, some of the impacts around agriculture. And Franklin County is certainly a hub of agriculture in the state of Vermont. So talk a little bit about climate change in Franklin County and what it might mean to agriculture up there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hard time for farmers. I don't call myself a farmer. I have 10 chickens and I grow a very small amount of crops for my family. But I know that especially my friends who are in the dairy industry have been incredibly impacted. And in Vermont, 70% of our agricultural industry is dairy. So I've reached out to a couple dairy farmers, but I haven't heard back. I'm sure they have plenty on their hands up early milking, but I'm kind of curious, what ideas farmers have for what they would find most supportive right now. I'm a big fan of, I have kind of a radical concept. I think that we need to stop the federal subsidies to CAFOs. And I think that if we stopped federally paying for all of the inputs like water and grain, so they were offered it virtually free to all the factory farms, then we could reallocate, it's about $225 billion a year to support small farmers. I believe that if factory farms had to actually pay for the community costs that we all carry, like the increase in everything from infectious diseases like MRSA, from antibacterial resistant strains, to the costs that we carry in our healthcare and environmental cleanup. I mean, factory farms are the #1 cause of both ground and water pollution in the US. So I actually wrote like a 30-page paper on this in law school, but I really think the solution is reallocating funds that we're distributing to these huge factory farms and giving them to our small farmers, because the small farms have a fraction of the environmental consequences. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but there've been studies done. Norway actually eliminated subsidies and they saw an immediate impact for the environment. And you can basically draw a direct line to the way that we subsidize these factory farms to how bad the environmental destruction in an area is. So my dream would be to see a lot of these funds reallocated to small farmers, so that not only can we support the small farmers in America, but so we can see a huge decrease in the huge environmental burdens that the factory farms have. In terms of like in Vermont, what we can do, I would love to see, you know, we have hundreds of people who are held in jail right now for really technical things, like lack of housing. There's 150 people in Vermont being held in jail because DOC hasn't approved their housing. So we pay $55,000 to $85,000 a year from our tax dollars to pay to incarcerate people for technical reasons. So I would love to see actually a complete rehaul of our criminal justice system, so that we could be spending that money on things like supporting small farms. So I know my ideas are a little bit extreme and they would probably take some time to do, but I would love to see less subsidizing to the huge factory farms, more support for our rural farmers, and a reallocation of funds that we're wasting to incarcerate people toward environmental conservation.
That would actually touch on all the issues we've talked about in a way, because I think if you replace factory farms with more family-based farms, smaller farms, you're not only talking about changing our environmental impacts, we talk about economic impacts as well. People who work on factory farms are basically there as, I don't want to call them slave labor, but low income, low wage labor on factory farms, as opposed to being able to get a good return to a family or a small farm that is willing to support its local community and make produce available to local people as well. So I think it's changing our agricultural perspective would actually have an impact that includes the environmental impacts as well as the economic impacts. I think that's really important to keep in mind, particularly in a rural state like ours. So I appreciate that.
Thanks. And I did find this one link that I thought had some awesome resources that I'm just gonna share with everybody, because there was some stuff on there that I just thought was really great.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today, having this conversation. I think it's really important, and it's important that we dialogue with not just with each other, but with those folks around the state and in our communities who understand how important these issues are as well, and not feel overwhelmed by talking about climate change and climate justice. It sometimes can seem a little bit overwhelming to folks, like, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to be able to get our hands around this? And I think what you folks have shown is that there are practical ways to get our hands around this and make progress. I think it's really important. I want to remind folks that there are 2 other upcoming panel discussions similar to this one that the Progressive Party is hosting: a panel on economic justice Thursday, October 22nd, and a panel on rural issues Thursday, October 29th. Both of them are at 8 p.m. and will be on Facebook, as well as available through the Progressive Party's website after they're completed as well. So appreciate people turning out and listening to those, as well as listening to this particular panel this evening. I also want to mention that the Progressive Party, as I have to mention, is the most successful third party in the nation. The only third party that's actually electing people to the legislature around the state and actually having an impact on the political realities within our state. I think it's really important to keep in mind the success of the Progressive Party and the importance that it plays in determining the issues that are important to Vermonters. I would also remind people that we do not take corporate money at the Vermont Progressive Party. We rely on support of people like you. So I would actually ask you to consider contributing to our work. If you support the Progressive Party, put your money where your mouth is as well, and really help us do the work that we need to do for all of us and move forward on these issues that are important to all of us, and do it without reliance on corporate contributions or outside money. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. It allows us to speak directly to the issues without worrying about outside influences. You can find out more and you can contribute at vermontprogressiveparty.org if you're interested. Again, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. I know you're all busy people, and I think it's important and very useful to have this kind of conversations out in the public as much as possible. Chloe Collins is a candidate for Franklin County State Senate. Representative Selene Colburn represents Burlington in the Vermont legislature and is active in the climate coalition in the legislature. Representative Mollie Burke from Brattleboro is a leader on transportation issues in the legislature. Lauren Hierl, the director of Vermont Conservation Voters, has been a leader in the Vermont conservation movement. And we didn't have time to talk about the other issues you've worked on around toxics, contamination, and other things that are important to Vermont. We'll have to save that for another day. And Heather Surprenant as a candidate for the legislature as well down in Windsor County. And Robb Kidd, who's the Vermont chapter coordinator for the Vermont Sierra Club. We really appreciate you all taking the time to be engaged in this conversation. Look forward to working with you all in the future as we take on climate change and other issues that are important to all of us. So I appreciate you all taking the time and look forward to working with you in the future. Appreciate it.